creeping through the haze, shadows dance in twisted ways, echoes hum from worlds unseen. This is where the strange convene. Step into the unknown mind, secrets hidden, twist and bind, truths that linger in between. Welcome to the spectral stream.
Have you ever felt like there's more to the world than what we see? Like there's something just beyond our grasp? I mean, we humans have always been drawn to the unseen, the mysterious. And today, that's exactly where we're headed. A deep dive into the invisible world.
You hit the nail on the head. And these historical texts you sent us on what they called experimental spiritism really give us a glimpse into this age-old fascination. It's like early, almost scientific attempts to understand these strange happenings, those hints of a spiritual realm. It's captivating stuff.
And it was you, our listener, who sent these in. Clearly, you're intrigued by how people in the past tried to make sense of spirits and their manifestations. But let's be honest, old texts can be a bit dense.
Yeah.
So in this deep dive, we're going to try to distill those core ideas about early spiritism, what they believed about spirits, how they thought spirits interacted with our world, and all the different perspectives that emerged. So where do we even begin to unpack this?
Well, the texts actually lay out this incredible range of thought on spirit manifestations. On the one hand, we have what they call negative systems, basically attempts to explain away what seem to be spiritual events using conventional explanations.
Like trying to debunk it all.
Exactly.
So they looked at things like charlatanism, and let's face it, there were probably some tricksters out there.
For sure.
And then there's insanity and hallucination. Like maybe it was all in people's heads.
Right.
And physical causes, maybe it was just the house settling or something.
Yeah.
And even reflex action, the idea that maybe unconscious muscle movements could explain things like table turning. So it seems like their first instinct was to try to find a rational explanation.
It's fascinating, right?
Yeah.
This human need, even when faced with the seemingly impossible, to seek an explanation within the framework of what we already know.
Absolutely.
And then on the other hand, we have the affirmative systems. These are the actual proposed explanations for these spirit phenomena.
The more out there ideas.
Yeah, and this is where it gets really interesting. We see this huge variety of ideas. There's the collective soul, this idea that maybe these manifestations are tapping into some kind of shared consciousness. And then you have the somnambulic system, where they link it to trance states, like sleepwalking, almost as if they were searching for analogies in known human experiences.
Makes sense, trying to relate it to something familiar.
Exactly. We also see the more traditional religious interpretations, the pessimist, diabolic, demoniac view, which says these manifestations are the work of evil forces.
So demons and devils and all that.
Yeah, and then you have the optionist system, which takes a more neutral stance. It's not necessarily good or bad, just a force. Quite a range, wouldn't you say?
Definitely. And when they got into the nature of spirits themselves, there was the unispirit or monospirit idea.
Yeah.
That there's just one type of spirit or a single source.
Right.
And then the opposite, multispirit or polyspirit, meaning there's this huge diversity of spirits out there.
Right, a whole spectrum.
And finally, the material soul, which suggests that the soul has some kind of physical substance. You know, it's incredible how many different angles they were exploring.
Truly is. It's a testament to their curiosity and dedication to understanding this. Now, these texts don't just focus on the believers and the explanations. They also delve into the skeptics, almost like a study in disbelief.
Oh, interesting. Like why people don't believe.
Exactly.
And they break it down into different categories. You have skeptics from pusillanimity, those who are simply too afraid of being ridiculed to even engage.
Makes sense.
Then there are those with religious scruples. These were folks who worried about conflicts with their faith, although the texts make a point of arguing that spiritism, if truly understood, actually aligns with core religious principles.
That's crucial, right? They weren't trying to tear down existing beliefs, but rather find a connection, a deeper harmony.
Absolutely.
They also mention skeptics from pride. These are people who might feel they're too intelligent or sophisticated for this.
It's like they're above it all.
Right. And those from the spirit of contradiction, people who just like to disagree no matter what. Classic human nature, right?
It's the contrarians. We all know a few.
Exactly. And then you have the skeptics from indifference or frivolity, those who just didn't take it seriously. And then a very telling group, skeptics from deception. These are people who had encountered fake experiences and therefore dismissed the entire phenomenon.
Yeah, you can see how that would happen. One bad apple spoils the bunch.
Absolutely. It underscores the importance of authentic, verifiable experiences, something the texts themselves emphasize later on. Finally, we get a categorization of spiritists themselves. This part gives some interesting insights into how belief works.
Okay, I'm curious. Break it down for us.
Well, you have the convinced spiritists. These are individuals who saw earthly life as this temporary stage, a trial focused on progress and charity, a very grounded perspective, I'd say.
Yeah, very much focused on the here and now.
Right. And then you have the exalted spiritists who were described as having this blind and childish confidence. The text suggests that these individuals were more susceptible to being duped and could potentially harm the credibility of the movement.
So a little too trusting, maybe even naive.
You could say that. It's a good reminder that critical thinking is important, even within a belief system. Now, how about we shift gears and talk about how spirits were thought to interact with our physical world? One concept that comes up a lot is the perisprit. So what exactly is this perisprit?
It sounds almost mystical.
It is, in a way. Think of it as this semi-material intermediary, a sort of energetic template, or a subtle body that surrounds the spirit itself. The texts emphasize that the true nature of the spirit, the thinking essence, remains unknown to us. We can only perceive its actions through this perisprit, so it acts as this interface between the spirit and the material world.
So, like, if our physical bodies are the vehicle for our consciousness in this world, the perisprit is the vehicle for the spirit to interact with the physical world.
That's a great way to put it. And this perisprit, while fluidic and adaptable, is still considered a form of matter, just a very refined one. They describe it as having the ability to elongate, contract, and transform, very responsive to the spirit's will.
The texts even say it can take on the appearance the spirit had in life, like scars or other unique features, so it can be recognized. That's a vivid image.
Isn't it? The texts also point to these instances of tangible apparitions, things like disembodied hands that have warmth and can grasp objects or even play musical instruments and then vanish instantly. They present this as evidence of the perisprit's material nature. It's as if it can shift between what we perceive as solid and fluid states.
That's pretty mind-blowing. So let's get into the actual physical manifestations that were observed. First up, the iconic turning tables. Probably one of the most well-known images we associate with early Spiritism. What was the initial explanation for this?
At first, people took it quite literally. They believed that spirits were physically moving the tables with their hands. However, the texts quickly point out a flaw in this thinking. If spirits can manipulate forces directly, why would they need a human intermediary for physical force? Shouldn't they be able to act on their own? Especially since many mediums only had their hands resting lightly on the table or weren't even touching it when the movement occurred.
Yeah, that makes sense. So if it wasn't ghostly hands actually pushing, how did they explain the table moving?
This is where the idea of the universal fluid comes in. The spirit of St. Louis, whose explanations are quoted throughout the texts, describes this as the fundamental principle of everything, the basic substance of the universe. It's related to electric or animal magnetic fluid, but distinct from them. And importantly, this fluid is what animates all matter, and it's what makes up the perisprit in a condensed form. So spirits weren't exerting force in the way we understand it.
So they were manipulating this universal fluid, and that's what caused the table to move. It's like a more fundamental level of interaction.
That's it. It allows for action without the need for a physical body as we know it. The texts even mention instances of a frail person effortlessly lifting a strong individual, and they attribute that to a temporary channeling of this external force.
Wow, that's powerful. Okay, moving on. Beyond these induced phenomena, like the table turning, there were also spontaneous phenomena. Why were these significant?
These are important because these events, things like noises, objects moving on their own, happened without anyone intending them to, sometimes even among people who had no prior knowledge or belief in Spiritism. That made it much harder to simply brush it off as imagination, since the people experiencing it weren't expecting it or trying to make it happen.
Throws a wrench into the skeptic's argument.
Exactly. However, the texts stress the need to carefully verify these spontaneous events to rule out illusions or trickery. It has to be genuine, which makes it much more compelling.
Yeah, you have to eliminate all other possibilities first.
Right.
One of the most common spontaneous events was noises and rappings. We've all heard the stereotypical spooky house sounds. How did they tell the difference between those and what they considered genuine spirit noises?
Well, they highlight certain characteristics that set them apart. They say that these spirit noises often had a very particular quality to them, an intensity, and a variation in tone unlike regular creaks and groans. They could be dry, hollow, soft, or loud and clear, and they would often change location and repeat with a kind of intentional regularity.
So there was a purposefulness to them.
Exactly, much more so than just random sounds. And even if some of these were caused by lower level spirits, the text suggests that sometimes higher spirits might even prompt these minor manifestations to get the attention of skeptics, to open them up to the possibility.
Interesting. It's like a little nudge to say, hey, we're here.
Exactly.
Okay, next we have objects thrown. I can definitely see how that would challenge explanations based on imagination.
Oh, absolutely. When an object just suddenly moves or flies across the room, seemingly on its own, with no one touching it, it really forces you to reconsider a purely materialistic view and entertain the possibility of some unknown intelligence at play. The texts even say it would take a considerable stretch of the imagination to deny these things when they happen.
Yeah, that's pretty hard to explain away. And then there's the even more extraordinary phenomenon of materialization, the spontaneous appearance of objects. They mention flowers, fruits, even jewelry. Now, that's some wild stuff.
It is. And the texts are quick to warn about potential deception. They acknowledge that trickery and sleight of hand were definitely possibilities. They say the best assurance of authenticity was the integrity and lack of self-interest of the medium. A thorough examination of the circumstances is vital, and a solid understanding of spiritism was also important to help spot anything fishy.
So not just accepting any random object that suddenly appears.
Definitely not. Critical thinking is key here. They even provide a theory for how this materialization might happen. The spirit Erastus emphasizes the need for sensitive mediums with highly developed mediumistic abilities. He says that these mediums, due to their excitable nervous system, are able to project their animalized fluid. Sounds familiar, right?
Like a connection to the universal fluid concept.
Yeah, maybe a specific application of that. Rassus explains that these materializations typically happen in private, spontaneously, often even without the medium knowing, and very rarely on demand. That raises suspicion towards any medium who claims to have complete control over it.
So a medium saying, spirit, materialize a teacup now, would be a bit suspect.
Exactly. The texts emphasize critical examination over blind faith, noting that these spectacular physical phenomena were actually less influential for genuine belief than the intellectual and moral aspects of spiritism. Interestingly, they also mention that some mediums could only achieve this materialization while in a somnambulic state.
Like sleepwalking.
That's right. Which adds another layer of complexity to the whole thing. So now, how about we move on to visual manifestations, apparitions? Could spirits actually be seen?
Ooh, spooky stuff.
It is pretty spooky.
So what do the texts say?
They say yes, particularly during sleep. They believed that when the body is at rest, the spirit is more free to perceive other spirits. They even describe dreams as lingering impressions from this state. So apparitions while awake, that was considered less common, but still possible.
Okay, so it could happen. What about the spirits themselves? Could any spirit appear visually?
Yes, they believed that spirits of all levels, from the highest to the lowest, could potentially appear. However, they might not always have the permission or desire to do so.
And why would a spirit want to make itself visible? What were the possible reasons for this?
Well, the texts suggest a whole spectrum of motivations, both good and bad. Good spirits might appear to comfort loved ones who are grieving, or to offer proof of their continued existence, to give guidance, or even to seek help themselves.
Wow, so spirits could need help.
It seems so, according to the texts. Now, as for the less benevolent spirits, they might appear to frighten or even try to seek revenge. There's even the suggestion that sometimes a spirit might be allowed to appear to test those to whom they appear.
That's a fascinating ethical dimension. So it's not always clear-cut.
Definitely not. Now, how did they believe we actually see spirits? Because the texts make a distinction. They say, we think we see with our eyes, but it's actually the soul that perceives.
So it's not a physical seeing, but a spiritual seeing.
Exactly. And they offer the fact that some people could see spirits even with their eyes closed as evidence for this.
Interesting. So how do spirits make themselves visible to the soul?
This brings us back to the perisprit, doesn't it?
It seems to be at the center of all this.
It really is. Spirits could modify their perisprit at will, creating a combination of their own fluidic energy and the fluidic energy of the medium. And that's why not everyone could see spirits. There needed to be a certain compatibility and a sufficient amount of these fluids present.
So there had to be the right conditions.
Right. Now, they do clarify that this wasn't a literal physical condensation, but rather a unique state that made the perisprete perceptible to certain individuals.
And were these apparitions always solid and tangible?
Not usually. They were described as more intangible, kind of like figures in a dream. However, they did mention instances where apparitions could make tactile impressions or even momentarily become tangible. This suggests a form of matter existing between the spirit and the observer.
So like a fleeting solidity.
Yeah.
Okay, was this ability to see spirits something that anyone could develop?
They believed it could potentially be cultivated, just like other faculties, but they cautioned against rushing the process, saying it could overstimulate the imagination and lead to false perceptions. Generally, they considered this ability to consistently see spirits quite rare. And while apparitions could sometimes be called upon, that was uncommon. Most of the time, it happened spontaneously, and it usually required a special faculty in the seer.
And what about the form spirits appeared in? Did they always appear in human form?
Human form was considered the norm, though they said a spirit could alter its appearance while still staying within the human archetype. Things like flames or lights were seen as effects produced to indicate their presence, not the spirit itself. They even dismissed the idea of will-o'-the-wisps being souls, attributing them to natural causes.
Makes sense. It's easy to mistake natural phenomena for something supernatural.
Exactly.
Now, the texts do mention this interesting anecdote about a blue flame appearing on the head of Servius Tullius. They present this as a real event, caused by a familiar spirit warning his mother, who was a seeing medium.
It's a striking image, and it highlights that the perception of apparitions could vary. Some might only see a light, while others could perceive the full form of the spirit. The texts also touch upon less evolved spirits temporarily taking on animal appearances, but they clearly reject the idea that animals are actually reincarnated spirits.
Okay, so animals are not vessels for human souls.
Not according to these texts.
So how did these seeing mediums perceive spirits in the everyday world?
Well, they saw them moving among the living, influencing our thoughts and emotions. Essentially, they perceived this parallel, invisible world all around us, just like a microscope reveals a world we can't see with the naked eye. It gave them a glimpse into this hidden realm and how it interacts with our own.
That's a pretty incredible concept. And they talk about these more perfect apparitions that seemed completely real, solid, even warm to the touch before suddenly vanishing. That's incredibly convincing.
It is. In these cases, the sense of touch, not just sight, confirmed their presence, making it much harder to dismiss as just an illusion. They even reference historical and contemporary accounts, like the phenomena associated with Mr. Home, as evidence of these occurrences, but they stress that, while extraordinary, these events aren't supernatural, just a different application of natural laws understood through the framework of the perisprete.
And the perisprete itself is normally invisible, right?
Yeah. Yes, like many other fluids or forces we know exist but can't directly see. It becomes visible through specific modifications, a kind of change in its molecular structure. It might appear vaporous and even momentarily take on the properties of a solid, tangible body before instantly reverting back to its ethereal state. But it's important to note that this change isn't driven by external forces, but by the spirit's own will.
So you can't just wish a spirit into visibility.
Not quite. Both the spirit's willingness to be seen and the person's desire to see are necessary, but there also needs to be that compatibility between their fluidic energies. The amount of this fluid the person emits needs to be sufficient, and the spirit also requires permission to manifest, which they might not always grant or might grant with certain conditions. The texts also highlight the perispirit's ability to pass through matter due to its subtle nature.
It's like it operates on a different set of rules.
Exactly.
They also emphasize that seeing apparitions in a waking state wasn't some new thing, citing both historical and contemporary examples, often involving deceased individuals visiting loved ones. And again, that idea of connection, even after death, that comes up again and again.
It does, doesn't it? This longing to maintain that bond. The texts also address what they call globular spirits, and they essentially debunk them as optical illusions caused by atmospheric conditions and how our eyes work. They say these are just incomplete observations and lack any signs of intelligent, deliberate movement.
So not actual spirit manifestations.
Right, more like tricks of the light.
Okay, so it's crucial to distinguish between genuine apparitions and hallucinations. The texts acknowledge that both exist. What's the spiritist perspective on hallucinations?
Well, they acknowledge them right away, stating that only materialists would deny their existence altogether. From a spiritist point of view, these hallucinations could be caused by being overly affected by stories or things you've read, leading to these imagined visions. But they also propose that spirits themselves, being semi-material, can intentionally appear in different forms, sometimes even taking on frightening appearances if they're mischievous or benevolent ones if they're more evolved.
So spirits playing tricks or trying to comfort.
Exactly.
What about those fleeting images we sometimes see in that half-asleep state or when our eyes are closed? Are those considered apparitions?
Well, the text suggests those could be genuine visions, as the spirit is freer when the physical senses aren't dominant. But they could also just be traces left in the brain from things we've seen before, like a lingering afterimage. Sometimes these traces can combine in unusual
It's
ways.
like our mind creating these fleeting montages.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. The texts connect this to the idea of cerebral impressions, a physiological phenomenon, but they highlight the importance of the soul in the explanation, a point of contention with purely materialistic views. And they do admit that purely material explanations might not cover every case, leaving room for something more.
Okay, so it's not all neatly explained.
Right, there's always more to discover.
Next, the texts touch upon these concepts called bicorporeity and transfiguration. Those sound pretty unusual. What are those all about?
These are presented as variations of visual manifestations, and they emphasize that these aren't supernatural, just unique expressions of natural laws based on their understanding that the perisprit of the living operates similarly to that of the deceased.
Okay.
So bicorporeity refers to the spirit of a living person appearing in a different location while their physical body stays put. This often happens during sleep when the spirit is believed to partially detach. It's like an out-of-body experience.
Like a projection of consciousness.
Similar idea. The texts even offer an example of a person's spirit appearing and bringing a familiar object with them to prove it was really them.
That's pretty wild. And transfiguration.
Transfiguration involves a temporary change in a living person's appearance, supposedly influenced by a spirit. Now, they do caution against taking the language used to describe these phenomena too literally. They stress that appearance should be understood as an aspect or an imitation formed from this subtle material principle, not the actual object itself.
So like a temporary overlay of something, not an actual physical change.
That's the idea. They're trying to get at the nuances of how these things might work. Moving on, there's a section called Laboratory of the Invisible World. What do they explore in this section?
It sounds intriguing, like they're experimenting with the unseen.
In a way, yes. They delve into the mechanics of how spirits might produce certain effects. For instance, they explain the clothing of spirits as appearances created by the perspire, again using the subtle material principle. They also address the question of whether spirits can actually duplicate physical matter.
So are there like spirit copies of everything?
Not exactly. They suggest that spirits have this incredible power over the elements in our atmosphere. They can concentrate and shape these elements at will to create appearances, rather than having pre-existing ethereal duplicates of everything.
That's a fascinating concept. It gives spirits a more active, creative role.
It does. Now, the texts also categorize the nature of communications from spirits. They divide them into different types.
So not all communications were equal.
Right. They were categorized based on their content and purpose.
Like a hierarchy of messages.
Yeah, you could say that. They were categorized as gross, frivolous, serious, or instructive, depending on the spirit and the message.
And what about the methods of communication? How did these early spiritists receive messages from spirits?
Well, initially, rappings, or what they called tiptology, were common. They used a system of knocks to get simple yes or no answers.
Like a code.
Exactly. That later evolved into what they called semitology, which is a language of signs. And then there's alphabetic tiptology, where the spirit would spell out messages letter by letter.
Clever. And they mentioned pneumatography and pneumatophony as well. What were those?
Pneumatography was basically direct writing. It's the idea that spirits could write without needing a physical intermediary. And pneumatophony was the purported sound of spirit voices, like hearing them directly. But ultimately, the focus shifted to psychography or automatic writing as the main way of getting messages.
Ah, the classic image of a hand moving across the page, seemingly on its own.
That's the one. And psychography itself could be either indirect or direct. Right.
Okay, break that down for us.
So indirect psychography involved using tools like baskets or planchettes, those heart-shaped boards that move around a board. These tools were thought to help facilitate the writing process. And then direct or manual psychography, that was just writing with a pen or pencil, the medium's hand supposedly guided by the spirit.
So like a ghostly co-writer.
You could say that. But the texts stress that these tools, these planchettes and baskets, they're just unintelligent instruments given a kind of temporary life and not the source of communication themselves. Just like a pen doesn't come up with the ideas the writer expresses.
Okay, that makes sense. So the focus shifted from the tool to the method itself, and they came up with these terms like psychography and typology
Yeah.
as spiritism became more formalized.
Right. It reflects a move towards a more scientific approach, a shift in terminology to describe the process itself. And that leads us to the idea of mediums. How did the texts define a medium?
It seems like a very broad term.
It is. They define a medium as anyone who feels the influence of spirits to any degree. And they go on to say that this capacity is inherent in all humans, so nearly everyone is a medium in some basic form. But the term is generally applied to those who have distinct and developed abilities that result in these observable effects.
So everyone has the potential, but some are more attuned to it.
Exactly. And they even go on to differentiate between mediums for physical effects and mediums for intellectual effects.
So some are better at the physical manifestations, like table turning, and others at receiving messages.
That's it. Though many individuals could display both types, the lines weren't always clear-cut. They then delve into these different varieties common to all mediums. First up are sensitive mediums.
Okay, tell us about them.
These are individuals who are particularly susceptible to sensing the presence of spirits. They might experience it through general impressions or even localized sensations. They could often tell whether the spirit was benevolent or malevolent based on the feeling they got.
So like a spiritual sense.
Exactly. But the texts warn that these mediums, being more sensitive, should avoid contact with negative or aggressive spirits as it could be detrimental to them.
Okay, that's good advice. What about natural or unconscious mediums?
These are the ones who produce these spirit phenomena spontaneously and involuntarily, often without even trying. It just happens.
So like a natural talent.
Exactly.
And then the opposite would be the optional or voluntary mediums.
Right. These individuals can consciously and intentionally induce spirit phenomena. It's a matter of will, though they still need the cooperation of the spirits for it to work.
So a collaboration between the medium and the spirit world.
Exactly.
And they go into detail about specific types of mediums,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, there's a whole list, starting with tipping mediums. These are those through whom noises and rappings are produced. It's a very common form of mediumship.
Like the ones we talked about earlier.
Exactly.
Okay, what's next?
Then we have moving mediums. These are the folks who can cause inanimate objects to move, also very common, according to the text.
Like a mind over matter sort of thing?
Yeah, very much so.
What else?
There are mediums for translations and suspensions.
That sounds impressive.
It is. These mediums can cause objects to move through the air or even levitate. Self-levitation was considered even rarer.
Wow, that's really something.
And then we have musical mediums who can induce the playing of musical instruments without any physical contact, a very specialized and rare ability.
Okay, so like a ghostly orchestra.
Exactly.
That's awesome. What else is on the list?
There are mediums for apparitions, those who can make spirits visible to others.
Like summoning spirits.
You could say that. And then the mediums for materialization, those who can help spirits bring physical objects into existence. That one was considered incredibly rare.
Wow, that's like conjuring something out of thin air.
Definitely.
And the list goes on, right?
Oh, yeah.
Tell us more.
They mention nocturnal mediums who can only achieve these effects in darkness. Though they say the spirits attribute this more to the surrounding environment than the medium themselves, and they warn that tricksters often use darkness to their advantage.
Oh, so easier to deceive people when they can't see.
Exactly. It's important to remember that skepticism was encouraged, even within this belief system.
Sure.
Then there are pneumatographic mediums, the ones who produce direct writing.
Like we talked about earlier.
That's right. And even though the spirits classify it as a physical effect, it was considered very rare and also very easy to fake.
So not as reliable.
Right. And then we have healing mediums. These are the people who can heal or soothe others, either through touch or prayer. The texts are careful to distinguish this from strictly mediumistic ability, though they say it's more of a characteristic of true believers.
Okay, so a different kind of energy altogether.
It seems so. And then we have excitative mediums. These are people who can actually help others develop their own mediumship, particularly the writing kind.
Interesting. So a kind of spiritual mentor.
You could say that. Now, moving on to special varieties for intellectual effects, they start with writing or psychographic mediums, and they really emphasize that manual writing is the most important form of mediumship.
Like physically writing out the messages.
That's it. They say it's the easiest, most complete, and most developable method for communicating with spirits. And even within that, there are different types of writing mediums. Mechanical mediums where the hand is controlled entirely by the spirit, intuitive mediums who write the thoughts the spirit suggests to them, semi-mechanical mediums, which is a mix of the two, and inspired or involuntary mediums where ideas come seemingly out of nowhere, like inspiration.
So a spectrum of control and influence.
Exactly. And then there are mediums for presentiments. Those who have a vague sense of the future, a kind of intuitive knowing. They're considered a type of inspired medium.
Okay, so a premonition.
Something like that.
What else is on the list?
Next are speaking or auditive mediums. Individuals who can hear spirits, which they say is a pretty common form of mediumship.
So like having a conversation with a spirit.
That's right. And then seeing mediums or clairvoyants, those who can see spirits, which is considered rarer. They warn to be cautious with those claiming this ability and emphasize the need to distinguish between genuine vision and illusions.
Yeah, it's easy to misinterpret things.
Absolutely.
And then we have the somnambulic mediums who communicate while in a sleepwalking state, often with their own spirit manifesting and communicating.
So in a trance.
Exactly. And then there are the painting and drawing mediums who create art under spirit influence, a less common but still fascinating ability.
A kind of artistic channeling.
It is. And finally, there are the mediums by special aptitudes. These are people who have a knack for receiving communications related to a specific area of knowledge or interest, like scientific mediums, historical mediums, moralist mediums, and so on.
Right, and they emphasize that spirits also have preferences for certain mediums based on their own affinity or knowledge, and that it's a mistake to expect every kind of good communication from a single writing medium. You need to consider both the spirit's nature and the medium's aptitude, as well as the intentions of the person asking the question. They say that spirits can actually perceive our thoughts and judge the worthiness of the interaction.
Wow, so they're discerning.
It seems so. And all this classification, they say it's based on observation and analogy, not strict categories. Some forms of mediumship are more common, others quite rare. This information, by the way, was reportedly given by the spirits themselves.
Interesting. They're weighing in on how they're perceived.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the formation of mediums. The texts really focus on writing mediums as the most accessible and widespread. How does someone even begin to develop this ability?
They say there's no real test for it. It's all about experimentation, the basic process.
Whispers creeping through the haze, shadows dance in twisted ways, echoes hum from worlds unseen. This is where the strange convene. Step into the unknown mind, secrets hidden, twist and bind. Enchanted tones, reality's edge becomes your home. Questions rise like fragile smoke, the uncharted realm.